If you've been putting off dual booting Windows 11 and Linux because you're worried about losing your files, bricking your system, or getting stuck at some cryptic BitLocker recovery screen, I get it. And honestly, that fear is more justified in 2026 than it used to be. This isn't the same simple process it was 5 or 6 years ago. Windows 11 leans hard on UEFI, Secure Boot, TPM 2.0, and BitLocker, and those security layers can genuinely turn a routine partition resize into a locked-out system if you skip a step you didn't even know mattered. But here's the good news. Dual booting is still completely doable. Still one of the best ways to get full native performance from both operating systems on the same machine, no virtual machine overhead, no compromises, and today I'm walking you through the entire process the way it actually works right now, with zero data loss as long as you follow every step in order. Let's get into it. Before we touch a single partition, let's talk about what we're actually building here, because understanding the structure makes every later step make sense rather than feeling like a list of arbitrary instructions to follow blindly. A dual boot setup means two completely independent operating systems living on the same physical drive, or across two separate drives if you have them, each in its own dedicated partition, sharing a single boot menu that lets you choose which one to load every time you turn your computer on. On a modern UEFI system specifically, Windows Boot Manager and the Linux bootloader typically coexist through entries stored inside something called the EFI system partition, a small, special partition that both operating systems share, with your computer's firmware deciding which bootloader to hand control to first based on those stored entries. Getting this right isn't complicated once you understand it, but it does mean you need to actually know a few things about your specific machine before you start, rather than just downloading an ISO and hoping for the best. Step 1. Figure out exactly what you're working with before you touch anything. This is the step almost everyone skips, and it's the single biggest predictor of whether your dual boot install goes smoothly or turns into an afternoon of troubleshooting. You need to know whether Windows is currently installed in UEFI mode rather than older legacy BIOS mode, whether your disk uses the GPT partitioning scheme rather than the older MBR scheme, whether BitLocker or device encryption is currently active, and whether your storage controller is configured in a mode Linux can actually see and work with properly. To check your boot mode, open the Start menu, search for System Information, and look for a line labeled BIOS mode. It should say UEFI. If it says Legacy, you've got some additional groundwork to do that's beyond the scope of a straightforward modern dual boot, since mixing boot modes between two operating systems on the same drive is a genuinely reliable way to end up with a system that won't boot either OS cleanly. Both operating systems need to be running in the same mode, UEFI or Legacy, not a mix of the two. Nearly every machine sold in the past several years ships in UEFI mode by default, so this is usually a formality, but it's worth confirming rather than assuming. Next, check whether BitLocker or device encryption is active on your system, since this matters enormously for what comes later. Windows 11 24H2 automatically enables device encryption on fresh installs if you sign with a Microsoft account and your hardware meets the requirements, which means a large number of people have full drive encryption running without ever having deliberately turned it on themselves. Open Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Device Encryption, or search directly for Manage BitLocker in the Start menu and check whether it shows as on for your main drive. Write down or screenshot your recovery key right now if it's active before doing anything else, since you're going to need it in a moment. This full drive encryption ties the integrity of your operating system directly to the boot chain, and any change Linux makes, even something as seemingly innocent as reading the EFI system partition, can be enough to trigger BitLocker recovery mode on your next boot. Step 2. Back up your important files, genuinely, not as an afterthought. I want to be blunt about this step because it's the single most important piece of advice in this entire video, and it's also the one people most often skip because they're confident nothing will go wrong. The safest approach is to back up everything you genuinely care about before resizing a disk. Partition work always carries some inherent risk, and even though Windows disk management is generally reliable, mistakes do happen. Copy your important documents, photos, and any irreplaceable files to an external drive or cloud storage service you trust, completely separate from the internal drive you're about to modify. This isn't me being overly cautious. For the sake of a disclaimer, this is a genuinely necessary step given that we're about to resize a live partition containing your entire existing Windows installation. And while the process is well understood and generally safe when done correctly is exactly the kind of phrase that should make you back up your files first regardless. Step 3. Suspend BitLocker before you touch a single partition. If Step 1 revealed that BitLocker or device encryption is active on your machine, this step is not optional. And skipping it is the single most common way people end up locked out of Windows during a dual boot attempt. If BitLocker or device encryption is enabled, suspend or disable it before changing partitions so you don't end up in a recovery key headache after rebooting. Open Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Device Encryption, and turn it off. Or if you're specifically using full BitLocker rather than the simpler device encryption, open the classic control panel, navigate to BitLocker Drive Encryption, and choose Suspend Protection for your main drive. Suspending rather than fully decrypting is generally sufficient and faster, and it tells Windows to expect the kind of boot chain changes that are about to happen without immediately treating them as a security threat requiring recovery mode. Oh, simple reboot. After a routine change to the boot configuration has genuinely sent people's Windows 11 installations into BitLocker recovery mode when this step gets skipped, and having that 48-digit recovery key buried somewhere in a Microsoft account become the only thing standing between you and a bricked-feeling system is exactly the situation this one step prevents entirely. Step 4. Shrink your Windows partition to make room for Linux. Now we're actually getting into the physical setup. Right-click the Start button and open Disk Management. Find your main Windows partition, usually labeled C, right-click it, and select Shrink Volume. Windows will calculate the maximum amount of space it can free up, and you'll want to enter a specific amount in megabytes for how much space to carve off for Linux. For comfortable, genuinely usable Linux installation with room for updates, applications, and your own files going forward, I'd recommend allocating at least 60 to 80 gigabytes if you have the space to spare, though you can get away with somewhat less if you're specifically installing a lightweight distro and know you won't be storing much locally on that side. Click Shrink, and after a few moments, you'll see a new block of unallocated space appear in the disk management window. Leave the space unallocated, don't format it, or assign it a drive letter, since the Linux installer is going to handle that part itself in a later step. If Disk Management's built-in shrink tool refuses to free up as much space as you'd expect, which sometimes happens due to unmovable system files sitting in awkward locations on the drive, third-party tools like Minitool Partition Wizard or AOMI Partition Assistant can often shrink more aggressively and cleanly than Windows' own built-in tool, and both have well-established free versions perfectly capable of handling the specific task. Step 5. Create your Linux installation media. While that shrink operation is settling, it's time to actually prepare your Linux installer. First, decide which distribution you're installing. For a first-time dual boot specifically, I'd steer you towards something with a large community, strong documentation, and a genuinely smooth installer experience. Ubuntu LTS, Linux Mint, or Zorin OS are all excellent, well-tested choices for exactly this scenario. Download the official ISO file directly from that distribution's website, and take the extra minute to verify its SHA-256 checksum against the value published on the official download page, since this confirms your download wasn't corrupted or tampered with during transfer, a step that's genuinely easy to skip, but takes almost no time and protects you from a corrupted installer causing confusing, hard-to-diagnose problems later. Once you've got a verified ISO, grab a USB drive with at least 8 GB of capacity, understanding that everything currently on it will be erased, and use a tool like Rufus or Balena Etcher to write the ISO to that drive as bootable installation media. Rufus specifically is worth calling out here since it's free, genuinely reliable, and has stayed consistently up to date with exactly this kind of Windows and Linux compatibility work for years, making it the go-to choice for a huge number of people doing exactly this task. Step 6. Boot into your firmware settings and confirm secure boot compatibility. Restart your computer with the USB drive inserted, and immediately start pressing whatever key your specific manufacturer uses to enter the boot menu or firmware settings, commonly F2, F10, F12, delete, or escape, depending on your brand. Here's genuinely good news that a lot of older dual boot guides get wrong. Most mainstream Linux distribution installers, including Ubuntu's Ubiquity and Calamares-based installers used by Mint, Zorin, and many others, gracefully detect an existing Windows installation and automatically add a chain load entry to grub or system deboot without you needing to manually configure anything. The recommended path for dual booting in 2026 is actually to keep secure boot enabled, provided you're using a distribution with proper verified shim support, which covers essentially every mainstream distro worth recommending for this kind of setup. Not with mainstream distributions like Ubuntu or Fedora specifically, since their bootloaders are already signed and work correctly with secure boot enabled. You'd only genuinely need to disable it for custom kernels or unsigned proprietary drivers, which isn't the situation most people setting up their first dual boot find themselves in. That said, if your specific installer refuses to boot or you hit a black screen the moment you try launching the USB installer, some machines do ship with firmware quirks, unusual custom OEM settings, or an inconsistent trust chain that causes friction here. If that happens, Temporarily disabling Secure Boot in your firmware settings can help you get past that specific hurdle and complete the installation. In doing so, you wow. Like brick Windows, though you should know, Windows will then display a small desktop watermark and lose security attestation for certain features, like banking apps and device encryption, until you re-enable it. I'd recommend trying with Secure Boot left enabled first, since it genuinely works for the overwhelming majority of setups now, and only disabling it as a specific troubleshooting step if you actually run into trouble. Step 7. Boot the installer and choose your installation method carefully. With your USB drive selected in the boot menu, you should land on your chosen distribution's live environment or installer welcome screen. Most distributions let you either try the OS first, running entirely from the USB without touching your drive at all, which is a genuinely great way to confirm your hardware, particularly Wi-Fi and graphics, works correctly before committing to anything permanent, or jump straight into install. When you reach the installation type screen, you'll typically see an option along the lines of install alongside Windows Boot Manager, which is exactly what you want for a straightforward dual boot. This guided option automatically detects that unallocated space you created back in step 4 and handles the partitioning for you, creating appropriate partitions for Linux's root file system and swap space, without you needing to manually configure anything. If you don't see this option, or if you'd rather have more granular control, you can choose something else or the equivalent manual partitioning option instead, and manually create your partitions within that unallocated space. Typically a root partition formatted as ext4 taking up the bulk of the space, and depending on your specific distribution and how much RAM you have, either a separate swap partition or a swap file handled automatically during setup. Crucially, whichever method you choose, you need your existing EFI partition, usually something like the first partition on your drive, to be mounted at DOS boot DOS EFI without being reformatted. This ensures both operating systems share the same EFI partition, which is essential for proper dual boot functionality going forward. The guided install alongside Windows Boot Manager option handles this automatically and correctly, which is honestly the biggest reason I recommend it over manual partitioning for anyone doing their first dual boot. It removes an entire category of potential mistakes. Step 8. Complete the installation and reboot. Once you've confirmed your partition setup, work through the remaining installer steps, time zone, keyboard layout, user account creation, and if you're offered the option, agree to install third-party drivers and media codecs during setup, since this saves you a meaningful amount of manual configuration work afterward, particularly around Wi-Fi drivers and video codec support. Let the installation complete, and when prompted, remove your USB drive and restart. During installation, the installer should automatically detect Windows 11 and add it to the grub menu on its own. Make sure the bootloader installs to the EFI system partition rather than the master boot record. Specifically, since installing to the wrong location is one of the more common sources of boot problems people run into afterward. The guided installation option handles this correctly by default, which again is why I'd steer a first timer toward it rather than manual partitioning unless you specifically have a reason to need that extra control. Step 9. Verify both operating systems boot correctly. After that first restart following installation, you should be greeted by Grub, Linux's boot menu, showing both your newly installed Linux distribution and an entry for Windows Boot Manager. Select Linux first and confirm. It boots into a working desktop, then restart, and this time select the Windows entry, confirming that Windows still boots correctly and that all your files are exactly where you left them. This is genuinely the moment of truth for this entire process, and if both operating systems boot cleanly, you've successfully completed the hard part. Once you've confirmed Windows still boots fine, and only after confirming that, go back into Windows BitLocker settings and resume protection if you suspended it back in step 3, since there's no reason to leave your drive unencrypted longer than necessary once the boot chain changes have been successfully made and verified. Now let's talk about what to do when something doesn't go according to plan, because troubleshooting is a genuinely normal part of this process, not a sign you've done something catastrophically wrong. The single most common issue people run into is Windows not appearing in the grub menu after installation, even though the installer claimed it would detect it automatically. If this happens, boot into Linux and run sudo update grub, or the equivalent command for your specific distribution if it's using systemd instead. This command scans for all installed operating systems on your drive and regenerates the bootloader configuration, and it very often resolves a missing Windows entry without needing anything more drastic. If you're on a distribution using system boot rather than grub specifically, check that distribution's own documentation for the equivalent regeneration command, since the exact syntax differs slightly. The second most common issue is the opposite problem. Your machine boots straight into Windows with no grub menu appearing at all, as if Linux was never installed. This usually means your firmware's boot order has Windows Boot Manager set as the priority entry rather than Linux's bootloader. Head back into your firmware settings, look for a boot order or boot priority menu, and move the Linux bootloader entry, often labeled with your distribution's name or simply Ubuntu or similar, above the Windows Boot Manager entry. If you encounter a BitLocker recovery screen despite having suspended protection beforehand, don't panic. This is exactly why you wrote down that recovery key back in step 3. Enter the recovery key when prompted, let Windows boot normally, and then go back and properly suspend BitLocker again before making any further changes to your boot configuration. Since a single suspension only covers a limited number of subsequent restarts before automatically rearming itself. If your Linux installation needs proprietary drivers that aren't signed for secure boot, commonly certain NVIDIA graphics drivers, you don't need to disable secure boot entirely to use them. Instead, after installing the proprietary driver, run sudo mocatil, import followed by the path to the generated MOK or machine owner key certificate file, then reboot into the MOK management screen that appears, a distinctive blue interface, and follow the prompts to enroll that key. This lets your specific unsigned driver run while keeping secure boot itself fully enabled for everything else. And if things go genuinely sideways, Grub overwrote in a way that's left you without a working boot menu at all, or Windows suddenly refuses to boot after a Linux update, don't reach for a full reinstall as your first move. A tool called Boot Repair, available as a bootable live environment in its own right, is specifically designed to diagnose and automatically fix exactly this category of dual boot problem, scanning your drive, detecting both operating systems, and rebuilding a correct working boot configuration without you needing to manually diagnose what went wrong yourself. A few longer-term maintenance notes worth knowing before we wrap up. It's worth being aware that newer firmware security technology, specifically Microsoft's Pluton chip that's increasingly showing up in newer hardware, may complicate dual boot setup somewhat further down the line, since it represents an even deeper integration between hardware-level security in the boot chain than TPM 2.0 alone provided. This isn't something that should stop you from dual booting on current hardware today, but it's worth knowing that the underlying landscape continues shifting, and staying reasonably current with your specific distribution's documentation around secure boot and firmware compatibility is a good ongoing habit rather than a one-time setup task you never think about again. It's also worth understanding that Windows updates occasionally modify boot configuration in ways that can temporarily push Linux's grub entry out of priority, effectively making your machine boot straight to Windows again after a major Windows feature update specifically. This isn't data loss, and it isn't your Linux installation being deleted, it's just Windows reasserting itself as the default boot option during its own update process. If this happens, the same update, grub command from earlier, run from within Linux after booting into it via your firmware's boot menu manually, one time will typically restore things back to normal. Finally, going forward, treat any major change to either operating system's boot configuration, a Windows feature update, enabling BitLocker for the first time, a Linux kernel update that touches bootloader packages specifically, as a moment worth paying slightly closer attention to rather than just clicking through automatically. Most of the time, nothing will go wrong at all, but knowing the specific fixes covered in this video means that on the rare occasion something does shift unexpectedly, you'll know exactly what's happening and exactly how to fix it within a few minutes, rather than panicking and reaching for a full reinstall. So, to recap the entire process from start to finish, check your boot mode and encryption status first, back up your files genuinely, rather than as an afterthought, suspend BitLocker before touching any partitions, shrink your Windows partition through disk management, create verified, properly written Linux installation media, keep secure boot. Enabled and let your distribution's installer handle detection automatically, choose the guided install alongside Windows Boot Manager. Optioned specifically for the smoothest, safest first-time experience, verify both operating systems boot correctly before considering the job done, and know exactly which specific fix to reach for. Update grub, boot order adjustment, MOK enrollment, or boot repair, depending on exactly what specific symptom you run into afterward. Follow these steps in order. Don't skip the backup or BitLocker suspension steps, no matter how confident you feel. And you should end up with a genuinely reliable, fully functional dual boot setup with zero data loss. If this walkthrough actually got you through your first successful dual boot setup, drop a like. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are hesitating on exactly this project, out of fear of losing their files. Let me know in the comments which distribution you ended up installing alongside Windows. And if you hit any specific snag along the way that wasn't covered here, I want to hear about it, since these threads genuinely help other people troubleshooting the exact same issue later. And if you want more careful, no shortcuts guides. Like this one, the moment Windows or a major distro changes something that affects this process, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because based on how much this landscape keeps shifting, there will absolutely be updates worth covering. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.